Hello, Dr. Kalman Andrassy here, continuing on in the series of videos about various interview techniques. I'm moving on to the notion of an oral history, which is a little bit different from an in-depth interview. So, where the in-depth interview tries to collect very specific information about really focused topics, uh, an oral history tries to collect a respondent's personal stories about some general topic or event. So you can kind of see it as sort of an intensive biographical interview that usually takes place over an extended period of time so that you can uh, pretty much cover an extensive part of a person's life. And really learn about the way that individuals live their lives from their own perspective, essentially. Okay, so it's a a very it's very much a collaborative knowledge generating kind of a tool that that the researcher and the participant kind of piece together a very reflexive story or narrative that that's really quite good at getting very in-depth um, information about a narrow segment of a person's life that isn't necessarily completely controlled and directed in terms of the kinds of information trying to be obtained by the researcher. So, with that all being said, an in-depth interview tries to focus on a particular topic, have a very narrow interview guide in place that allows individuals to kind of uh, uh, answer the questions that the researcher wants to get to. And oral history essentially invites the individual providing the response to give their own perspectives and things like that. So, even more so than with an in-depth interview, gaining rapport in trying to obtain an oral history is definitely high on the list of priorities. You're essentially asking somebody to provide their life story narrative, and that requires more than a little bit of trust, and it leaves individuals potentially open to experiencing a range of emotions that could be both positive as well as negative. So that's kind of important to kind of focus on. So the oral history is definitely less narrowly focused, and it's more general in its approach. And you can kind of think of it as asking somebody what the process is that got them from whatever it is that they're relating to where they are today. So it goes beyond just description, but it really asks people to live out their experiences and really personalizes things. And it's really about narrating life rather than just responding to a set of questions. Okay, so that's why you need to be able to establish that high level of rapport. And ultimately, right, as the researcher, you have authority over how a person's life story gets presented. So it's very important for you to kind of consider, what perspectives and attitudes and any preconceived notions you might be bringing into a study that might affect the overall analysis and the interpretation of what's going on. So, again, you're trying to assume the role of an active listener. You're trying to pull information out of individuals, but at the same time, at the end of the day, you're the one who writes down what happened. So you have to be very careful as far as how you're exploring the kinds of things that you're getting individuals to talk about in conducting an oral history. Okay, so in addition to that, you want to think about how the respondent is actually presenting the information that is being provided. Um, you've got to kind of think about the narrative structure and whether or not individuals are, focusing chronologically on explaining what happened and, reflecting on their experiences. That would be something called a unified narrative style. Or it can be contrasted with a more episodic narrative style where the individual tells the story as episodes that might not necessarily be as chronological. Instead, focused on themes or really important components of the events that they're talking about. If you see that an individual has more of a segmented narrative that is a little bit more fragmented or disconnected, it might be a sign that the individual that you're interviewing might not have thought about the topic very much, or that they're looking at things in a new way. Others might just engage in sort of a conversational kind of narrative style that focuses on retelling conversations that took place in the past. And usually what that means, if they're not necessarily connecting themselves to the experience, but rather just what was said, it might be an indication that the individual wants to avoid, really feeling strong emotions about that particular event that took place. So, you have to kind of pay attention to that sort of thing. Pay attention again to the voice of the individual. That includes, the nonverbal gestures or intonations or expressions or bodily movements or speech patterns. Even silence might be something that's relevant to note in paying attention to how individuals kind of produce their information. So the way in which things are kind of presented to you as far as the nonverbal communication, it might lend itself to coming to a better understanding of what's going on than simply focusing on the words, right? Sometimes the nonverbal communication or the style in which things are being told is going to cause you to reconsider the things that are directly being said and maybe frame them in a different way entirely. Okay, so as you kind of write and present your final data, you have to, again, keep in mind that it is a collaborative process between the researcher and the respondent to try to produce meaning in an oral history. And a big part of that is actually editing down what may have been said. So in general, when you conduct an oral history, you probably want to have a direct transcript of what transpired. In general, I would suggest refraining from doing things like paraphrasing or adding information that wasn't provided by the respondent. And really anything that was recorded verbatim should be presented verbatim in the final report. But at the same time, you have to also consider other considerations about the presentation, right? If there's anything that is illegal or potentially socially or politically disadvantageous for a person to talk about, right? Somebody starts saying something that may be considered racist, or somebody talks about engaging in some sort of illegal activity. Those are choices that you have to kind of think about before presenting that information in its entirety. And the relationship between the researcher and the narrator or the subject of the oral history interview is really going to be of central consideration as far as the ethics are concerned. So think about the benefits and the harms associated with the data collection and the reporting process in sharing any story that is ultimately told. And of course, beside that, as far as analyzing the data, you're going to want to explore the concepts and the topics much the same way you would as an in-depth interview, right? You want to look at themes that are discussed if you're going to be doing multiple oral histories to see how people's discussions may be interrelated and things like that. With an oral interview, sometimes it's enough to just have one person discuss their experiences in whatever set of circumstances it is that you're exploring in the research phase of the exploration. So you've got to be you've got to kind of pay attention to what are the more important themes, the more important trends if you do have multiple people, and the similar and dissimilar components of the interpretation of the events that took place, so that you can piece together a strong narrative that really explains and considers all angles of the information that was ultimately collected.